to today's episode of Emerging Technology Conversations. Today we have the wonderful Barrie Harrop, who is in South Australia today. Barrie, how are you?
I'm very well, thanks, Debbie, and thank you for the invitation.
No, you're most welcome. And Barrie has had a 40-year plus history in the Australian developing, pardon?
Yeah, major urban projects.
Building in Australia. So today I thought we'd talk about a little bit about your history and maybe what you see is going to happen in the future for housing in Australia, because it's a major topic at the moment. But maybe just a little bit about you before we start.
Sure. Thank you, Debbie. Yeah, I've kicked around the block a few times over 40 years. On current day values, I've put together about $20 billion worth of major urban projects in Australia. And one of the criteria in all my major urban projects is inclusiveness. And I've allowed in all these projects between 30 and 50% for affordable housing, basically on the principle of social responsibility. And a lot of those projects I've won at national, international public tenders of government agencies. And I've taken that line primarily because I believe that there's a social responsibility, and I exercise that through my projects, and these inclusive communities are really thriving, and would you believe have achieved above average capital growth over the decades, and are very tightly held as well. So, you know, inclusiveness does work, and I've proven it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember many years ago, I think I was a teenager when I went to New York, and it was very much like on this side of the street, you had, you know, $1 million apartments, and then next door it was like social housing, and it was just a big mix of people and nationalities and things, which I think we sort of lost here a little bit. There's not that, you know, that mix. It's sort of quite insular little pockets here.
We have. Unfortunately, Australia's capital cities over the last 2 or 3 decades, Melbourne and Sydney particularly, to a lesser extent perhaps Brisbane and Adelaide, but these cities have become enclaves really for wealthy families, and the workforce that supported these cities have been driven out of the cities seeking affordable rents, pushed really to the outskirts of the cities, and are faced with commuting times of 2 or 3 in Sydney, you know, 4 or 5 hours daily, basically energy sapping commuting times. And now everyone in Melbourne and Sydney is wondering, well, why is the city so dead? I mean, you know, these people are now working from home in the basically irreversible trend of working from home. And like we are talking today on Zoom, there's a Zoom generation now developed,
Yeah.
and these people are quite happy working from home out in the outer suburbs, and they've got no plans to come back to the city, primarily because there's a lack of affordable housing in these cities because of the lack of inclusiveness in the policies and the planning of these projects in these cities over the last few decades.
So do you think it's been a planning issue over the
It's
years? I know
essentially,
yeah, sorry.
it's essentially a matter of social responsibility. Federal, state, and local government agencies over the decades have sold off vast tracts of land in inner city areas of Melbourne, all capital cities of Australia, and they've had no requirements, no mandatory requirements in selling off public land to set aside a percentage for affordable housing. Unlike the Mayor of London, he has a mandate that requires the council, the London Council, selling off surplus land suitable for residential use. All of that land, 50% must be set aside for affordable housing. Well, the outcome of that policy has created 35,000 affordable dwellings in London. So it does work. and it's all about inclusiveness and the ethics of dealing with public land. It's selling land off at the highest price for the highest bidder and building apartments for wealthy residents is not a very smart use of public land, I can assure you.
No, absolutely. And I've been reading that you have, if we're going to talk about housing and the future of housing, you have some new technology, because we are a technology
Well,
podcast.
it's kind of new. It's about 3 decades old. Essentially, in the Scandinavian and European countries, they developed a process called engineered wood, which is from renewable plantation forest trees, basically into cross-laminated timber. So it offers a speed to market solution in advanced modular, and that basically solved their housing crisis in Scandinavia with a faster market solution in advanced modular. And these houses are stunning designs, beautifully detailed and finished, because they're all designed and built in factories and to exact millimeters and very limited requirement of, there's no waste. They utilize 100% of the tree. They create new products from the waste parts of the tree, all kinds of innovative approaches. I mean, in Australia, with our plantation forest trees and our old growth forest trees and destroying that resource is pretty woeful. But in the plantation forest trees, for example, in Australia, 30% of that tree is actually left to rot on the ground or burnt.
Oh, what?
And in the Scandinavian countries, they've actually, from that waste product, they've developed a whole new GDP growth export stream from waste products. So they've created incredible new markets with that waste product in the world. And here in Australia today, we burn or let that 30% of those trees
Really?
go to waste.
My goodness, I didn't know that. So what would you recommend for us to get this started? How do we get this?
Well, we've taken a lot of people say it's our whole scope and presentation of scalability is a kind of overnight success story. It's actually about a 5-year overnight success story. We've been spending close to $1 million a year on R&D, developing our IP. It's actually quite complex with all the building acts. They're all different across Australia, all different requirements to actually get the model to a scalable position. And we've done that now, and we're kind of ready to go to the market. We have presented our capability to various government agencies last year, which was an unsolicited request. And we're working with various state government agencies to integrate our model, our offer into the market. We're 75% faster than custom building construction, and we've got little or no waste in valuable building materials. But we have a stunning design solution, and it's sustainable because the cross-laminated timber is stored carbon. So it's a very good environmental story, and it's a very sustainable way to live. The wood is a very tactile material, and in the early days of our assessment, I had friends living in Scandinavia. I had an office in Copenhagen for a number of years, so I asked some of my
You've had
friends to go.
offices everywhere, Barrie.
I have, yes, indeed, including Beijing. So I asked some friends to go along to a new cross-laminated timber hotel to check it out, and I gave them an unusual request. and they were quite amused by my request. I asked them when they went into the hotel to check in to sit in the lobby for 15 to 20 minutes and then ring me back and tell me what people did when they first came into the lobby. And they couldn't kind of work out why I made that request. Anyway, they did what I asked them to do. And they rang me back and said, "Oh, Barry, well, everyone that came into the hotel, the first thing they did was walk up to the columns and stroke them." I said, "Right, thank you. That's what I needed to know, because they don't do that with concrete columns and steel columns."
No.
So the tactile experience started as you walked in the door, and
Yeah.
then that followed through to the whole hotel. Um, and it has a very calming effect as well. And would you believe, the hotelier gets a premium on the rooms because people vote with their money, and they want that kind of tactile, sustainable experience, and they want to see real um, carbon capture, not greenwashing in hotels with,
Yeah.
all that kind
Yeah.
of stuff they do. So yeah, so we've gone down that pathway. We're planning a whole range of international hotels in CLT, and hotel residence projects, and we've got a very scalable program. We presented to the New South Wales government our scope to deploy up to 25,000 mid-rise residential grade apartments per year. Now that, to give you some idea of what that number means, that's 3 times the number of apartments built in the whole of Australia every year. So
Wow.
that
So where can I
that's
ask where are you going to get this workforce? It's
well,
that's the difficult thing at the moment.
true. I mean, just in New South Wales alone, last year, 20,000 tradies left the state. Um, so uh, cross-laminated timber is not requiring the same level of skilled workforce because everything is made in the factory. And the factories operate 365 days, 24/7, and they're basically automated, highly automated factories.
Ah, okay.
And when the material gets to site, it's basically like a big Lego set. So it just needs to be assembled. So you don't need the concentration of skilled workforce that you do with custom building. And the custom building methods in Australia, it's a very fragmented industry. People come and go from building sites. Today it's taking between a year and 2 years to get a house built,
Mm.
because the lack of skilled workforce, and the slow, inefficient construction methods that basically been practiced since the 50s in Australia.
Yeah.
You know, you go to any building site in Australia today, and you would struggle to find a brickie under 60 years of age. You would struggle to find a concrete guy under 50. The young guys, it's all too hard for them. You know, yes,
I
they'll.
think there's been a push in high schools to try and get kids through to university, and not they haven't really like the path. It's starting to change now. They're starting to realize, trades are important, but the image of a tradie and the image of a person in a suit is very different.
Yeah.
But tradies
Yeah,
make more money, honestly, most of the
well,
time.
the young guys, the easy job as a tradie is a carpenter, because it's highly automated. They've got nail guns, they've got saws. They don't have to work that hard. I mean, it's a skilled job, but they're earning like $1,000 a day. These young guys, and
Mm,
they get tax advice these days. These guys, so they're driving around in $150,000
yeah,
Dodge Rams,
yeah,
and because of and when the surf's up, they go to the beach and surf. They don't have to work 5 days a week anymore. They work 3 or 4 days a week, and that's fine. And if the surf's up, they'll go surfing with their
yeah.
mates. So it's a different culture today, with these younger guys, particularly the carpenters. The bricklayers, I don't think they go surfing, but you don't see the old beaten up cars at building sites anymore. They're all $100,000, Dodge Rams, whatever. Um, a house is being built down the road from us at the moment. I counted 5 Dodge Rams there the other day. I mean, these are like $150,000 each.
Yeah, I wish maybe maybe I should start carpentry.
Yeah, so they're doing okay, but my point is that because they're doing okay, the productivity is very low. They'll only work when it suits them. Not They don't work 6 days a week anymore. These guys, not the young guys anyway. Maybe the older guys do, but certainly the younger guys, they'll work when it suits them, basically. So that's part of the problem, and the crisis in Australia for affordable and social housing is not just like an overnight phenomenon. That's been building for 3 decades. It's just the political parties over the election cycle have just kicked the can down the road, basically, and
Yeah.
ignored that situation.
I know I have a friend whose parents lived in so public housing, and there was no upkeep at all, really, for like how many 30 years 30
Yeah.
years, and there was no thought of upkeep. There was no new housing in the area. It was just sort of
No.
forgotten, really.
The unfunded maintenance liability in Australia today in social housing is about $10 billion. And if by some miraculous event the government could wave a wand and find that $10 million, you'd question whether or not you'd actually spend that 10 million on houses that were built in the 50s and 60s that are basically not fit for purpose by today's living standard requirements. They're basically poorly configured houses for this era. So you'd be questioning whether you actually spent that money on these poorly configured houses. So the crisis is actually worse than the government would like to know in terms of their ambitions to build, 1 million dwellings in the next 5 years. The actual market requirement is today, not in 3 or 5 years' time. The
Oh,
market is
absolutely.
short. The market is short today, 1 million dwellings for a social and affordable housing. So it's a much bigger crisis than the federal, state governments will accept. And you just have to look at the demand for rental accommodation. It's not unusual to see 200 and 300 applicants per dwelling these days in the real estate agents.
But
So
what upsets me is, like, you have a family, a few kids, and then you can only find a two-bedroom apartment, and it's like nearly $800,000 a week. I mean, how can you afford that? And you're cramming so many people into a two-bedroom apartment. It really upsets me.
Debbie, the thing is they can't afford it, and it's not sustainable. And it's not sustainable in many ways. A family with its income can't. It's not sustainable to pay 50 to 60% of that family income in rent. It's just not sustainable. A fair percentage of a family income is about 20% to rent. That's sort of the guide, the benchmark set. That benchmark was set by the late Alex Ramsey, MBE, who founded and managed the South Australian Housing Trust, a world leader in its time in social housing. And he set that formula that was a fair percentage that the family could afford. And that really hasn't changed today. But you've got families in Melbourne on the eastern seaboard of Australia paying 50 and 60% of the family income in rent, which is just not sustainable. And more importantly, those families are subject to enormous pressures of dislocation because they don't have secure tenancies. They might have a 6 or 12-month lease. And that's very disruptive for families having to shift and move schools, stress of finding new accommodation, all continuously pushed out, seeking lower rents. And then they're relying on motor cars, which they can't afford to run. I mean, those families out in some of those suburbs, they've got less than $1,000 in the bank, some of these families. So if something goes wrong with their motor car, they're in strife.
Mm.
Um, in terms of getting to their jobs, getting their shopping, getting the children to school, etc. So um, there are solutions to the problems, and I think the Minns government in New South Wales is starting to address these with the massive rezoning of around 37 of the 170 metropolitan railway stations to mid-rise housing. That's a very good start in my view. So if you look at all the transport infrastructure in Australia, it was primarily built and paid for in the 70s and 80s and 90s. All of that infrastructure is fairly underutilized.
Oh, we've
Um,
ripped it out here. We used to have trams on the Gold Coast and Brisbane, and they were all ripped out. But we are rebuilding new infrastructure, so that's good.
Yeah, well, the thing is to get sufficient density around that infrastructure so that within a tram stop, say a 400-meter radius, walking, it's a comfortable walking distance, you've got higher density rather than single detached dwellings. I mean, around over 90% of all of Australia's transport infrastructure is surrounded by single detached dwellings. Well, that was fine in the 50s and 60s, but today, with the housing crisis, the more density is required around that public infrastructure, and it doesn't have to be 30 and 40-story tower blocks.
No,
I'm talking about 4, 6, 8-level mid-rise residential grade apartments, um, creating sense of communities around those transport nodes. So, yeah, the New South Wales government are on track to starting that process, which is great. Other governments are a bit slow in understanding that they need to look at more density. But I guess they'll be watching pretty carefully the New South Wales government. And we're pretty excited about what they're doing as well, of course, because it's where our offer is best utilised. We're scalable in residential grade mid-rise apartments. That's really our target market. And that market, by the way, is also not just applicable to social and affordable housing. It's also there's 2 million baby boomers, my generation in Australia, that have got family homes they're paid for, and they want to stay in their communities. And there's very limited options for those families to downsize.
mm,
So there's a potential to free up 1 to 2 million existing family dwellings in the marketplace by having enough downsizing options.
mm,
I mean, some people in my generation are happy to stay in their house forever, whatever, but a lot of my generation want an apartment where they can lock up and go, they can travel, they don't have to worry about security issues, all that kind of thing, maintenance, etc. So there's a very fertile market there, and that's not being catered for in Australia.
yeah, that's true. I've spoken about that before, and it's hard though because I think families have issues as well when it comes to the family home, but that's a whole nother story. Uh,
Yes.
but but I've always thought, and I never understood this, is here we have massive shopping centers, like massive, like so much footprint on these massive, but they don't build housing on top of them. Whereas, if you go to any other city in the world, all the shopping centers, they have high rises above them, or living above
That
them.
Yeah,
Um,
no, the major malls in Australia from the 50s and 60s are very car centric um, in terms of their footfall, and that trend is still developing in Australia. They haven't realised that people probably are quite happy to actually walk to the shops. So they've got vast tracts of land around these shopping malls, which can be developed into mid-rise accommodation. And a lot of these shopping malls have got adjoining transport corridors,
oh
right?
yeah, well
Even
they've
on
got
rail,
buses and
railway stations, all of that that's public funded infrastructure, you
Yeah.
know, for their benefit. And so I think they're starting to look at that, and that will be a trend in the next few years, I guess. They'll start to realize that they've actually got to be more community oriented and target that market, particularly with the downsizing market. My generation, there's 2 million of us floating around the country that would be looking for the kind of handy downsizing options near the shopping, near the transport, all of those kind of requirements.
Yeah, absolutely. I think my husband doesn't want to mow the lawn anymore either. But I think we're going to wrap it up now.
Okay, thank you, Debbie.
Do you have any last words? So, the future of Australian housing, what are your last words?
Well, Australia is a AAA credit rated country. Excuse me. It's one of 9 countries in the world with a AAA credit status. There's absolutely no reason we should have a housing crisis in this country with the wealth and the future we have. We have one of the brightest futures of any country in the world in terms of our resources and capabilities and all of the things going for us. We just need to get on top of solving the housing crisis and start being adventurous and look at scalable models that can solve the crisis.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you for watching Emerging Technology Conversations today. And thank you, Barrie. It's been wonderful talking to you.